I was originally asked, obviously, to speak in the Heartlands and Peripheries section. As a Roman archaeologist, as you can imagine, when we talk about the Heartlands, we don't tend to talk about Scotland, because when you actually look at a map of the Roman Empire, we're very much on the northwest periphery. So the best one in the world, I can't suddenly say, and of course Scotland was the heart of the Roman Empire, because obviously that was the heart of the Roman Empire. But I think what I want to do today is just briefly explain to you some of the reasons why the study of Roman Scotland in particular is of vital importance for our understanding of the Roman Empire more generally. And a lot of it is to do with the predilections of individual emperors. Why did they even bother coming to Britain? Why did they come to Scotland? And I also wanted to present a Roman emperor that was colourful rather than actually present the very sanitized views that survive today. So I thought, well, obviously everyone knows when the Romans, apart from Julius Caesar, first came to Britain. Is anyone watching Britannia? Yeah, I won't ask you what your views are of it. I've seen one episode so far, but I thought, I've now got an image of Aulus Plautius. So there you go. But when the Romans first came in, we get very, I very much specialise in the military side of things because I specialise in Roman Scotland, and we don't get much that isn't military when you're actually looking at the physical remains. We don't have villas, we don't have towns, don't have all that nice stuff that you get down there. And what we actually get is some very interesting remains of an ebbing and flowing of conquest. So when they first come in, obviously you start getting, you get the movements in, and then you get consolidation of conquered territory. And Britain, in essence, took quite a long while to conquer in various areas. Wales took 30 years. There's a wonderful quote from Gladiator. I wish I could remember who said it, but somebody comes along in Gladiator. Sorry, I know Adrian likes his pop culture references, so I'll stick with these. Is people should know when they're conquered. And I always say, it's the one that always strikes me as being very apt when you're dealing with the Roman army. But when you actually start dealing with Roman Scotland, we've actually got really a lot of discrete episodes for the Romans in Scotland. And I say it's very military focused. There's obviously a huge amount of interaction and material culture being found on Iron Age sites, but I'm assuming Fraser will be covering that a bit more in his talk. But also Fraser's one of the people that's pointed out how little material culture that there was coming from the Romans to Scotland prior to the Romans themselves physically coming here. So it's an interesting aspect of the dynamic in Iron Age societies. A few people have talked about terminology this morning and some of the issues we have. We have similar challenges and issues with the Roman sites as well, but I just thought for the terminology I'm using, I'm assuming that's probably fairly familiar to most of you. Fortress, the big ones, big legionary things, forts, garrisons, fortlets, smaller garrisons, towers, which are performing specific functions, and camps, which is my bread and butter, which is all the different ways of moving around the country. Most of them in Scotland are marching camps, but you get other types of camps as well. And anyone who knows me knows I can't give a lecture without telling you what a camp is, and preferably showing a nice picture of small miniature soldiers, which are always my favourite. But we have more camps in Scotland than any other province in the entire Roman Empire. We have a wealth of material just showing the amount of times that there were attempts to conquer the country, but also because these were only occupied for a very short period of time, they're very, very difficult to date. And so there's you can play lots of games with numbers and speculation, but at the end of the day, unless you've got really some serious dating evidence, they are quite tricky. Why is this not moving on? Okay, brief historical context. Most of you probably know that. There's basically three main periods of incursion into Scotland that are documented in the literature with other ones, but the archaeology never paints such a simplistic picture. So we've obviously got, coming up here, we've got the 1st century Flavian conquest of Scotland, the Battle of Mons Graupius, wherever that was, and then the abandonment. You've got a consolidation on pulling back to what then became the line of Hadrian's Wall, Hadrian's death, movement into Scotland and the Antonine conquest. We've got tentative literary references to other campaigns, but detecting them archaeologically is very, very fraught with difficulty. And then in the early 3rd century, Severus comes up here with what can only be described as genocidal desires to actually complete the conquest of Britain, but died before he actually was able to do it. And then we've got these tantalising references later. So we're sitting there in this historical context. And for years, archaeologists have, I think, probably tried to spend too much time trying to make it all fit. Whereas in reality, when it doesn't fit, that's actually when the edges get blurred and it gets interesting. Vespasian, he's one of the people that initially organised or ordered the Flavian advance in Scotland, and he had been part of the initial conquest in Britain, so he had physically been to Britain. So although I say, okay, we were very much on the periphery, some Roman emperors and some very significant people had actually come to Britain at various stages. We also have the biography of the governor, one of the governors of Britain, Agricola, and so everyone's trying to fit everything into being Agricolan, and it doesn't always fit. And the thing you'll find with Roman archaeology is that sometimes you'll get everything presented to you as, and this is how it was, and it's very definitive, and it's as if there's no confusion or anything, when actually there is a lot of confusion, and we're dealing with, a lot of the time, a theoretical model that was constructed in the 1960s. And we actually need to get to a point where we can move the dialogue further along. So there we've got Vespasian, and these are the other two Flavian emperors, Titan and Domitian. This is the Roman fortress at Inchtuthil. This is a very unique site, because this is an entire Roman fortress which doesn't have a building on it. Pretty much every other Roman fortress in the empire has a town sitting on it of some description, or a city. So Vienna being a classic case in point, Bonn, Chester, York. We've actually got a field in Perthshire, so we have some of the most spectacular remains, but also the other unique thing we have in Scotland is we have things that are occupied for a short period of time. So we have very, very strong sort of chronological models that we can use to then actually ask really quite detailed questions that aren't blurred necessarily by multiple phases of use. We've also got some slightly curious things. Here's a bizarre camp with these funny little, what look like tadpoles things. We think they're probably lime kilns. No one's dug them. So it may well be, this is a lime kiln from somewhere else, but it may well be that actually we've got some fantastic fired evidence in this that no one's ever looked at. I mentioned Tacitus, we've got the Agricola. We've got this text, and people have spent too long trying to say, well, in AD 82 he did this, and in AD 83 he did that, and therefore he must have built these sites here. Archaeology is not as neat as that, and actually it's quite nice to say, and Tacitus never came to Scotland. So he was, and he's also written it, it's a biography, and we've used a biography to interpret history, and there are, as you can imagine, a lot of issues with that. What we can do is say, I don't think he necessarily was inventing large amounts of stuff, but I think a lot of the detail we have to take with a pinch of salt. So I've just sort of had some of the ones. I mean, they've got some wonderful things like this, you know, infantry, cavalry, and marines mingled in the same camp, joyously sharing the same meals, dwell on their overachievements and adventures, boastfulness and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's wonderful rhetoric. Where does that take us with the archaeology? When it comes to actually starting to say, how can we date these things, about 15, 20 years ago, the developer-funded excavations at Kintore really made a massive difference in expanding our knowledge of the Roman army on campaign. And in this site here, you've got 180 Roman ovens that were only in use for a short period of time for an army that was marching through. And a detailed series of radiocarbon dates. Romanists are very good at relying on pottery and that kind of thing to date sites, and it's actually very interesting that we're starting to actually get other scientific techniques helping us to then ask different questions of the data that we've got presented to us. So at the moment we think that Kintore looks like it was part of these first century campaigns. A few years ago we came across a completely upstanding Roman camp in Esdale-Muir, which has a Neolithic bank barrow running down the centre of it. And in a classic example of subjectivity and bias, the Neolithic bank barrow was perfectly mapped by the Royal Commission, where I used to work, and they completely missed a Roman camp that was sat on top of it. So we took great delight in pointing that out. But just to say that there's actually stuff like this still surviving in the landscape. Dalswinton, this was a site that we all thought we knew everything there was to know about Dalswinton, because in the 1950s, somebody did a trench that size through it. So when people present Roman archaeology to you, remember that they're operating, that was the theoretical framework they're operating in the 1950s. Recent geophysical work on this site actually suggests that some of the interpretation work that they've actually then placed from this tiny trench is just wrong. So you have to go back and revisit these excavations, and don't believe everything a Romanist will tell you. Here we have a recently discovered Roman fortlet at BLADNOCH down in Wigtonshire, very nice geophysics by Tessa Poller. Prior to that point, we had a speculative road. I mean, this is a classic road to nowhere. Here we've got a Roman road going somewhere. We don't know where it goes, but there must be a fort somewhere. And here we've got a new fortlet there. That road is in the wrong place. The red line is wrong. The red line's what appears on maps. So that's what it tells us about the 1st century Roman occupation when we actually try and put together the jigsaw of all this dating evidence. Now I'll whiz swiftly on. What I wanted to say on the periphery and heartland notion is that although, yes, we look like we're very much on the fringes, it's quite possible that the ambitions of the Romans at the time were rather different. And recent reinterpretation of some of the work at Chester has identified this utterly bizarre building, known as the elliptical building, which the excavator has been suggesting is potentially the kind of thing you get in a provincial capital. So suggesting that actually there was intended to be a grand plan for Britain and probably Ireland with a centre there in Chester. At that point, you then start to think, okay, this is now starting to look. The Romans possibly thought of this as a province. So although we're sitting on the periphery, it's a key area for the Roman conquest. 1st century, the Romans pull back. Trajan comes along. Trajan's much more preoccupied with Roman Dacia, modern-day Romania. Then we get Hadrian. Not going to dwell on him. He's by far the most famous emperor, and he did so little up here. No point mentioning him. His successor did quite a lot up here, but sadly, one of the most boring Roman emperors you will ever come across. So I think we kind of suffer slightly from that. But he built the Antonine Wall, and I will come back to the Antonine Wall shortly. And the recent work, I wasn't going to mention Burns Walk, but as I noticed there's a poster over there. There's now suggestions that the camps at Burns Walk down in southwest Scotland, I think Burns Walk was mentioned by you in your talk, Ronan, this morning. 2 camps on either side of it may actually date to this 2nd century occupation. We have a series of quite well-dated sites. We have a massively complex network of fortlets coming in here. And recent research on Roman fortlets suggested that they only put fortlets in places where they are insecure. So therefore, that looks like parts of Dumfriesshire were not easily conquered, and that possibly helps. Some Romanists will basically tell you, well, the Romans can conquer anywhere they want, and they were never worried about Scotland. The archaeological picture paints a rather different view. We then have Septimius Severus. I've mentioned here, he physically came to Scotland, and it's quite nice to think that there are actually 1 or 2 fields in the borders where you can look at this nice quiet field and know that actually 2,000 years ago, the whole of the Roman Empire was being ruled from that field. Septimius Severus was there with his entourage. So I sort of think, thank you, do you think that's actually quite a nice aspect to this, despite the fact when you start reading about Septimius Severus, as I say, genocide just about is the right phrase to use. We've got some very, very large sites. This is the Roman fort at Newstead, but we've got a very large camp outside it. It's the latest feature on site. No actual dating evidence for it, but the fact that it's later than the Antonine things, and it's huge, makes us think that's possibly one of the ones that was occupied by Severus when he was up here. So we have this very partial, very east side of the country looking map that we can produce at the moment. But when you actually start looking at classical maps, how they may have looked at us, there's a whole other series of literature that's written about Ptolemy's geography, but it's an interesting perspective on Scotland, isn't it? The other thing about Severus is I mentioned the elliptical building in Chester. It comes back. So did Severus say again, big province of the British Isles with its headquarters at Chester? That's possible. And then there's a pulling back to Hadrian's Wall, which was then rebuilt and then becomes the boundary of the empire with, as I say, these incursions that we get. Now I'll finish off by mentioning the Antonine Wall. I mentioned it very briefly earlier. It was occupied for roughly a generation. It's one of only 6 World Heritage Sites in Scotland. We're very fortunate in Scotland that we have a bunch of politicians who are actually interested in World Heritage. I think the First Minister can probably name all 6 World Heritage Sites. I don't think very, very many First Ministers around the world could name all the World Heritage Sites in their country. We have, well, there's a fantastic collection here at the Hunterian that's come from it. There's material, obviously, at other museums. The National Museum has the Bridge Nest slab. There's a lot of work happening on the Antonine Wall at the moment because it is one of our 6 World Heritage Sites. We launched, anyone like computer gaming? Go Roman was launched earlier this month. Download it, have a play. It's based on the best evidence that we can get from all the experts that we've spoken to, using Bar Hill and various other things, and it's actually quite fun. So you can be a Roman soldier and play around. We've got websites, we've got various things in development. We've got a huge lottery bid going in this year for just under £2 million, which is going to, following on from what Jenny was saying, it's actually going to create some Roman-themed play parks. Now that's the bit that excites me most. Sorry, I have primary school-age children. We're also going to get some more replica distance slabs. So when it comes to the Romans side of things, I think there's a very strong impact that can be had, particularly, as I say, because we've got one of the World Heritage Sites. It also sits very much within its international context, so you can't study the Romans in Scotland in isolation. You have to look at what's going on everywhere else. But I'll finish with my rant, which is that there is not, right now, a Romanist in an archaeology department in Scotland teaching and researching Roman archaeology, and it's one of 6 World Heritage Sites in Scotland. Orkney has the brilliance of Orkney College, plus loads of other universities having interest. St Kilda's had 3 PhDs on it in the last 5 years, and it's the most studied group of islands. The other ones are more sort of built history related, but when it comes to archaeology, who's going to inspire the undergraduates and who is going to nurture the postgraduates if it's not the academics in the universities here? And I'll leave you with that thought, and also suggest that those of you at Glasgow might want to ask why your powers that be have apparently just axed your new Roman post. Thank you.